The Whitaker farm sits alone in the endless fields of barley, where time seems to slow down and the seasons are the only clocks people care about. Located in western Nebraska, this land has long forgotten the noise of the city, the neon lights, the flash of life. Here, there is only the smell of hay, cow dung, and dreams that never have a name. John Whitaker, 47, is a man with a stooped back from years of farming, tanned skin, and calloused hands. His wife, Martha, is 2 years younger, with a voice as soft as a goose feather but eyes as hard as Midwestern soil. The two have been together for more than 20 years, working the land their parents left them. They tried to have children. But after 3 miscarriages, 2 failed attempts at adoption, and a long string of sad days, they both accepted their fate. They have no children, and may never have them. It was a rainy night. Thunder had been pouring since the afternoon, and dark clouds had rolled in like a thick, gloomy blanket covering the sky. Martha was herding the chickens into the coop when the first drops of water fell on the tin roof like a war drum. John, as usual, was in the cowshed, checking the vents and covering the straw to keep warm. Around midnight, when the rain had become heavy, the dogs barked like an alarm. At first it was a low whine, then it became a frantic, panicked cry. They did not bark like squirrels or deer, but a harsh, seething sound, as if they were confronting a stranger. John got up from the old armchair, reached for the old shotgun hanging on the wall, jerked the flashlight, and put on his frayed leather cap. "It could be a wolf," he said hoarsely. Martha stood at the window, clutching her nightgown. "Be careful, John." He did not answer. He just nodded, opened the door, and stepped out into the rain. The flashlight beam cut through the pouring water, swept across the wooden fence, through the mud puddles, and then toward the cowshed. The dogs were still barking, but they didn't dare go near a corner of the barn, where wet straw and old tools were piled up for a long time. John moved closer, his hand tightening on the gun. A strange smell filled his nose, not the smell of wolves, not the smell of corpses, but the smell of people. Strangers. "Is anyone there?" he growled, his eyes darting around. No answer. Just a patter of rain on the tin roof and the wind whistling through the cracks in the wooden door. But when he shone the light into a corner, those eyes appeared, big, round, frightened eyes, wide open as if they couldn't close anymore. A boy. About 6 years old. His body was trembling under the thin, wet blanket, his feet muddy and his lips purple. Not a word. Not a cry. John let out a gasp, put down the gun, and moved closer, kneeling. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy backed away to the corner, his eyes panicked like a cornered animal. John didn't ask any more questions. He took off his coat, gently wrapped it around the child, and picked him up. The boy was as light as an empty sack of rice. His body was so thin and cold that he felt his whole body shiver. Martha gasped when she saw John enter the house with the child in his arms. What happened?" "Someone left him in the barn," he said, placing the boy on the sofa near the fireplace. Martha ran to get a towel, hot water, and some warm milk. The boy still said nothing, just looked at them both with a look of scrutiny mixed with fear. When Martha handed him the glass of milk, he backed away. But then, as if his survival instinct took over, he took it and drank it down, his eyes never leaving the two of them. That night, the couple did not sleep. They laid the boy in the guest room, watching by the fire, occasionally pulling the blanket up around his neck. John searched the boy, finding no papers, no address, no identification of any kind. "We have to call the police, right?" Martha whispered. John sat still for a moment, his eyes fixed on the fire. "If they put him in an orphanage, will he be treated well?" Martha was silent. They had both visited the orphanage once before. The empty eyes, the screams at night, the musty smell of despair, they could not forget it. John turned to his wife. "Let's keep him. At least until we find a real family." Martha nodded, her eyes welling with tears. The next morning, the boy was still silent, but his eyes softened at times. Martha handed him a flowered handkerchief, and he took it, smiling for the first time, albeit very slightly. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated. There was a silence that seemed forever, then he whispered, Eli. Martha put her hand on her heart. The name echoed in her heart like a broken piece that fit into a blank space. Eli, she whispered. Would you like to stay with us for a while? Eli nodded, with confidence for the first time. From then on, Eli became part of the Whitaker family. No one in town knew exactly where he came from. Some people whispered that the Whitakers had picked him up somewhere, but eventually everyone had to admit Eli was a special child. He learned quickly, was diligent, and was polite. He learned how to milk a cow in a week, how to plant corn in a month, and how to make Martha he laughed even though she was tired. He was quiet, but his eyes lit up whenever he studied or listened to John tell old war stories. As the years passed, John and Martha no longer mentioned finding a family for Eli. It seemed that, in their hearts, he was already their son, no more reason was needed. One autumn evening, when Eli was about 10 years old, John sat on the porch, holding an old guitar. He strummed a few notes out of tune, then suddenly said, Eli, do you know how you came here? Eli nodded. On a rainy night. In the cowshed. John chuckled, his eyes shining in the darkness. Yes. And from that day on, this house was no longer as quiet as before. It was alive, warm. It had your laughter. Eli leaned his head on his shoulder. They both sat silently, watching the falling stars, neither of them saying anything but knowing in their hearts there were families that did not need to be related by blood. And then, in the old cowshed, the fate of 3 people officially began. 12 years had passed since that fateful rainy night. Eli was now 18 years old, tall, strong, and exceptionally intelligent. His dark brown hair was neatly cropped, and his eyes burned like fire in the harvest wind. Despite his mysterious birth, Eli had never let it become a burden. He had grown up in the fields, growing up with the sound of roosters crowing in the morning and afternoons milking cows with his adoptive father. John taught him how to drive a tractor. Martha taught him how to make cinnamon apple pie. But most importantly, they taught Eli what love was, a love that did not need to be tied by blood, but was deeper than any string. He was the pride of his town. He had been the valedictorian of his rural high school for 2 years in a row. He had always stood in front of the football team, then ran straight to his books after every victory. People used to joke, Eli was born to do something great. But Eli never thought beyond the fertile land and the simple wooden house. One afternoon in August, John stood on the porch, holding the ivory letter the postman had just delivered. His eyes blurred as he read each line. Congratulations, Eli Whitaker. You are one of 3 outstanding students in the state of Nebraska selected for a full scholarship to Columbia University to study economics and public policy. Martha cried before Eli could react. She did not speak, only held the boy she had found in the rain. Eli stood still. Every cell in his body trembled. Columbia, New York, the world was so much bigger than his fields and cornfields. You deserve it, Eli. John put his hand on his shoulder, his eyes shining with confidence. Don't be afraid to step outside. But remember, your heart will always be here. New York was a dazzling symphony of sound and light. Things moved faster, louder, and colder than Eli had ever known. His dorm looked out onto a cracked concrete wall, and every night was a silent soundtrack of honking cars, arguing people, and a life so crowded it was suffocating. But Eli didn't falter. He studied day and night, becoming an honor student after just his first semester. He took a part-time job in the library and then an intern at a prestigious financial firm, Winchester Holdings, headquartered in a gleaming blue glass tower in Midtown Manhattan. At first, it was just long days of filing, making coffee, quietly sitting in the corner of the office. But Eli impressed with his lightning-fast ability to read reports and his sharp critical mind. He was promoted to the executive floor after only 3 months, a rare feat for an intern not yet 19. At a winter party organized by the company, Eli was asked to welcome a special person, Mrs. Edith Winchester, the founder and honorary chairman of the corporation. She was almost 80 years old, but still maintained a noble demeanor. Her silver hair was tied in a bun, her eyes were sharp as knives. She did not smile, did not shake hands, only looked at Eli with a strange look. Then she stopped. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked at Eli as if she were seeing a ghost. "Young man," she said after a few seconds. "What is your full name?" "Eli." "Eli Whitaker, ma'am." She swayed. The assistant beside her quickly supported her, but she waved her off. She pulled a silver pendant from her shirt, opened it. Inside were two small photos. One was of a young man with sharp eyes. The other was of a baby. The eyes were very similar to Eli's. "Do you have a birthmark on your left shoulder?" she asked, her voice trembling. Eli paused. He remembered. The small, crimson, teardrop-shaped birthmark. Martha's mother had called it an angel's kiss. He nodded. Edith sank into a chair. She cried. For the first time in years, tears streaming uncontrollably. "You are my grandson." The story was told in a private room, where red velvet curtains blocked out the loud lights from the city. Throughout the entire session, Eli could barely breathe. His biological parents, Charles and Diana Winchester, heirs to the prestigious Winchester family, were murdered while returning from a Vermont forest. The police declared it a robbery, but Edith always believed it was a plot to gain inheritance. What no one expected, during the escape, a loyal nurse took the baby, Eli, and fled down a path through the forest. She disappeared with him, leaving only a torn shirt and a bloodstain by the stream. The police pronounced the baby dead. But Edith never believed it. She kept the locket. She lit candles every day on Eli's birthday, even though she didn't know he was alive. "You're the last bloodline," she said. "The rightful heir." Eli felt torn in two. He left the conference room and ran down the glass hallway, his legs numb. When he got back to his dorm, he collapsed on his bed and opened the drawer to take out two photos. One was his biological parents' graduation photos Edith had just given him. The other was an old photo of John and Martha, smiling, their hands on his shoulders on his 12th birthday. He cried. They were flesh and blood. But why does the heart ache so much? Eli left the dormitory a month later. He wrote to John and Martha, saying that he had to move to the city to work full-time at the company. He didn't say anything about his background, didn't reveal anything. Martha read the letter, sitting quietly at the wooden table for an hour. She didn't cry. She just held the handkerchief embroidered with Eli's name, touching each stitch as if touching her son's skin. John just quietly went to the cowshed, cleaning it himself. That night, he burned the expired farm insurance papers, then sat alone on the porch, looking out at the empty fields. "My son's grown up," he whispered. "He's got to fly." At the end of the chapter, Eli sat in his 28th floor office, his suit neatly tailored, looking out at the skyscrapers. In front of him was Edith, now happy and content. She said, "You're home. Your family is waiting." But Eli whispered, "I'm not sure where home is." Outside the window, it was raining again. That spring in the Midwest was unusually dry. John and Martha's fields were not as green as they had been in years past. The corn was discolored, and the ground was cracked like the faces of seasoned veterans. But what kept them up at night was not the weather, but the flyers from a real estate company called Silver Ridge Development Group, a name that sounded fancy but was full of threats. The company wanted to buy the hundreds of acres surrounding their farm. The reason, turn the peaceful countryside into a luxury resort. Villas, golf courses, and marinas, things that had nothing to do with the lives of people like John and Martha. John initially refused. But then they came, in droves. Each time a man dressed better, spoke more smoothly, and made more threatening remarks. They talked about tax liens, about the old mortgages John had signed when he bought his tractor, about small but disastrous terms. "Do you want to lose the whole land at public auction or sell it honorably?" The broker's voice was sweet, but his eyes were like vipers. Martha sat silently by the window, holding a cold cup of tea. She had never been so afraid as she was now, not because the house was about to be lost, but because of the feeling of helplessness. She had raised a child since he could not call his name. But now the house was empty. There were only 2 people at each meal. Only John worked the fields during each harvest season. Eli was no longer here. In New York, Eli had no idea what was happening. He was working in his private office on the top floor of Winchester Tower, a name that was now in his blood. His schedule was packed, with shareholder meetings, investment projects, mergers. He was so busy that he could hardly distinguish between Saturday and Monday. The world of the rich, he realized, was a terrifyingly lonely place. One night, as Eli was reading a land zoning report his assistant had left on his desk, he froze. The last page was a map of rural Nebraska, the land where he had grown up, to be exact. The land was marked in red as Whitaker Farm. Next to it was written, Owner's Transfer. Expected completion next quarter. His hands were shaking. He stood up, pulled out his phone, and called his home. No one answered. Just before midnight, Eli took a domestic flight, then rented a car and drove straight to the old town, where the streetlights were barely enough to illuminate the muddy dirt roads. He reached the gate of his house just before dawn. Martha opened the door, her hand still shaking as she recognized the familiar voice. Eli, she exclaimed, as if in a dream. He held her tight, feeling her thin body melt inside him. I'm sorry. It's been so long since I've been home. John stood on the porch, his eyes filled with tears. He said nothing. Just nodded, then went into the kitchen, poured another cup of coffee, as if Eli had never left. That morning, they sat together for a long time. John talked about the pressure, about the paperwork, about the harsh reality that they had less than 60 days before they had to give up the land. We applied to the town council, but they're all bought off, Eli. They want to clear the whole field. Eli listened with a tightness in his heart. He felt his blood boil, not with anger, but because something inside him had awakened. He was not just a Winchester, he was the boy who had slept in the barn, who had ridden on the back of his foster father's tractor, who had learned to read by the light of his mother's oil lamp. He stood up. I'll take care of this. 2 weeks later, at Winchester headquarters, Edith received a business proposal from Eli himself. Part of the investment was to buy all of Silver's farmland. Ridge Development and turned the area into a rural American cultural preserve, sponsored by the Winchester Legacy Fund. Edith looked at Eli with a puzzled look. You want to turn that area into a preserve? Yes, Eli replied. No resorts. No mansions. Just land. Farmers. And memories. I know most of the shareholders don't agree, she said softly. But you have the final veto. Eli looked deep into her eyes. And this is a favor I ask of you. There was a pause. Then she nodded. Not because of blood, but because she knew the true successor to this family would not be the richest, but the one with the biggest heart. The day the Silver Ridge Corporation was announced to be canceling the entire project, Nebraska was in a festive mood. John couldn't believe his ears when he received the new land ownership certificate. No more debt, no more threats. Martha took her husband's hand, then looked down the red dirt road that led to the fields. Eli is back, she said. Not just home, but back to himself. The following summer, on the land that had been nearly leveled, Eli held his first harvest festival. The neighbors came to help, bringing cider, pumpkin pie, and laughter. Edith showed up, too, her first visit to the Midwest. She wasn't wearing fancy clothes. Just a thick sweater and a simple silk scarf. She stood in the middle of the field, her expensive shoes caked with dirt, watching John guide the children in planting vegetables. This is what he loves, she whispered. Eli stepped forward and held out a bright red apple. I told you I was the heir. Now you know. I've inherited both worlds. She laughed, gently for the first time. And you picked the best part. As the afternoon wore on, Eli sat on the wooden steps, between his foster parents, watching the sunset over the golden cornfields. The smell of grass, of baking cookies, of memories filled the air. Father couldn't give you the blood of a noble, John said. But you gave me your heart, Martha added. Eli smiled. And I wouldn't trade that for the world.